Well, welcome back to GLBC Connections. This Sunday morning we're going to be celebrating the Lord's Supper or communion at our church. As we do that, it's appropriate today. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians 11 to think about communion as Paul talks about it. In fact, we're going to see a passage that I read pretty well every time I lead communion at our church and see it in its context and what it's trying to tell us about communion. As we do that, I want to tell you about that great American business ritual, the business dinner. This is the dinner that takes place sometimes when large groups of people from multiple businesses get together. Usually we would talk business during the day, and then in the evening we would all go out and eat together. Whenever we did that, whenever I was part of that, typically you hung out with people who were your counterpart, that is, of the same basic situation or position in the other business. So as a supervisor, I would hang out with other supervisors. As a manager, I would hang out with other managers. When I was a quality person, I would hang out with other quality people. And that's just kind of how it went. You hung out with those who were of your like place in the business world. And that was a pretty universal rule. I saw it broken every now and again, but it was pretty rare. Well, it turns out, as Paul talks about communion to the church in Corinth, they had a roughly similar problem. Not really problem, but they were doing that, and Paul is going to point out how big a violation it is of the Lord's Supper and of this thing that we do together. So this is from 1 Corinthians 11. Paul says, "In the following directives I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. No doubt there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. So then when you come together, it's not the Lord's Supper you eat. For when you're eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or you to despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter." Well, what was happening, it seems like what would happen was the people would come together for communion within their local church. Their local church met not in church buildings but in homes, and typically they would meet in the homes of wealthier people. If you visit some parts of that area around Corinth or around the places where that occurred, the old homes, the wealthier had their home really was a set of rooms that would often be built around an open area. Class distinctions in the Roman Empire were very, very important. And so the people who owned those homes would have people over, but it's very possible, and actually I would say likely, that when they ate together, they didn't really eat together. The wealthy people went in and inside, and the poor people in the church sat outside in this atrium open air area. The wealthy people, they had good food to eat, food they brought or food that was served by the wealthy homeowner. The poor people had nothing. In fact, so critical was class distinction in Corinth and in the Roman Empire that there were possibly people coming to the church who did not belong to any household. And what I meant by that, they weren't attached to a household. They didn't have a wealthy patron. Even if you were a servant but you were attached to a household, you were at least taken care of. It's entirely possible they would go and they were not part of a household. They didn't have somebody to take care of them, and so they came with nothing. And then what happened? A meal was served, and those who had food ate it and were satisfied and maybe even drunk. And those who came without stayed without. And Paul is very unhappy with this. And why is that? Well, he points it out in this passage that we often read during the communion service. This is chapter 11, verse 23. "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Paul is saying basically that we who follow Jesus Christ, we look to his example. And what did he do? On the very night he was betrayed, he gave himself, all of who he was. He gave his very life. And on the very night he was betrayed, he instituted the Lord's Supper. On the very night in which he did this incredible act of self-giving, he instituted the Lord's suffering, and in that he instituted the Lord's Supper, and in that he broke down all barriers between Christians. All barriers were torn down. Paul says those barriers were torn down on the very night Paul gave all of who he was, and you won't even share food. Well, for Paul, that was a huge indictment, to not understand how the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ unites God's people together so that there is no class distinction. That was a very revolutionary message in Corinth in the time that this letter was written to the people. I'm not sure it's no less revolutionary now. Even now, we find as we look around our culture, people are segregating by class, and class distinctions are becoming larger even within the U.S. And churches, there are middle-class churches and churches in poor areas, and there are black churches and Asian churches and other kinds of churches. We don't often come together. Those class distinctions have risen back up, and I think Paul would be just as dismayed over that. Paul says when you get together as believers, there should not be class distinction. There should not be racial distinction. We belong to one another. We are united by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Even for us, and I'm thinking of myself here, we struggle even, I think, with class distinction and look down our noses and chuckle at people who sometimes don't wear the right things, or don't smell the right way, or don't have the right jobs. Paul would be dismayed by that. And even as I read this passage, I'm struck as I think about how we treat different people within the Christian community. And struck by the fact that Paul would often probably be critical of today's church as well. You know, if you go to a business dinner, you eat with people of like station. That may be true. But when you come to the church, you gather with all of God's people together. We respect each other equally. We worship together equally. We share among each other equally. This is God's call. And this is the heart of the problem that they were experiencing in Corinth. And the solution was a focus on the Lord's Supper and how the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ unites us together. So, this Sunday when we celebrate it, I want you to remember those things. Remember what Paul was really talking about. Remember that the institution of the Lord's Supper does indeed break down class distinctions, puts us all together, and unites us around the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us today. Always glad you're with us, and hope you continue to be encouraged by these devotionals.